Hello and welcome to my presentation on effective leadership through communication. It's a privilege to be part of the Women's Id unconference this year, and I'm very excited to share my own reflections on how important communication is to becoming an effective leader. Before we get started, just a quick understanding that in 2016, Forbes magazine actually published an article on leadership. And talking about leadership in general, they mention the fact that communication is critical. And of course it's critical because it's the way that we need to exemplify our mission and our vision onto others. But we also need to remember that it is to motivate, inspire, and manage relationships. And during teaching, not only do we need to be leaders in the classroom, but in some circumstances and in some roles, we also then need to lead other colleagues as well. So when we're in a leadership position, it is very, very important to remember that we always have to think strategically about what we're saying and how we're saying it and how we might come across. As Forbes pointed out, it is important to remember that what we do both on and off the battlefield affects our ability to lead. It isn't necessarily that communication is a battlefield, but it is something that you need to tread lightly on. And the more that we know about identifying effective oracy skills and effective communication skills, the better leaders that we are that are able to inspire, manage, and motivate others. Now, when we think about the different types of communication that we need to take into consideration, there are obviously, you've got the written and the spoken language. So we've got an informal dialogue between two people. Even in an informal dialogue, we still have to be conscious over the fact that we may be in a position of seniority, and in those kind of circumstances, although the dialogue is informal, we do need to still tread carefully on what we say or how we say it, because misrepresentation and misinterpretation are key areas of a breakdown in communication that we can't afford to have. There's also obviously a formal meeting. Those formal meetings are obviously more scripted, they're a more legal requirement to them, and they often come with supporting administrative liaison, so to speak. We've also got addressing larger cohorts, so for example a group of colleagues during a professional development, or when we're looking at a class of students. So when we're dealing with a larger cohort, we need to consider how we're communicating with them and how we're exhibiting those oracy skills in the correct way. And then we've got the written forms of communication as well. So we've got emails and letters and memos and anything else that will be read and needs to be interpreted with a message attached to it. Now, there are obviously, when we talk about the amount of communication styles that there are, it does become clear that Forbes' interpretation of it being a battlefield is actually quite correct. There are minefields everywhere that we need to navigate our way through, and it's not that hard to do as long as we just take some key areas and take some examples with us, and we're learning as we go along. So I'm just going to give you a couple of strategies and techniques today that hopefully you'll be able to utilize in your own circumstances as well. So the first one is obviously being present. Now, being present is a big one. I know I'm awful at it sometimes. Distraction is obvious. When we're not 100% focused on what is right in front of us, it does become apparent to our audience. With a lack of engagement and this distraction, it's obvious that there becomes a strained strand of dialogue to it. And these are the circumstances where there is a breakdown in communication because one of the parties isn't necessarily 100% committed to what's being said there and then. In the case of a classroom, students can pick up on this and they often become disengaged with their own learning. And in terms of dealing with colleagues, it can actually make staff feel inadequate and in almost like an inconvenience to be having that communication with them. So there are a couple of tips to supporting this idea of being present, because it is a vital one for all of us. The first one, if necessary, and it may to some people come across rude at the start, but ask them to wait, or at least organise a specific time so that you can finish the task that you're doing, so that you can avoid that strategy. When we think about methods in the classroom that we used, and we think about things like the countdown strategy, the reason that countdown strategy is there is to allow the train of thought to cease. Because if the train doesn't, if that train of thought doesn't cease, then what we find is that students are inclined to continue talking. And of course, they're inclined to continue talking because they probably haven't finished their own dialogue. So it's just the same kind of circumstances. Finish what you're doing before that conversation takes place so that you can give it the full commitment. The other thing is that when dealing with things like deviant behaviour, predominantly in students, the idea about keeping your focus specifically on the delivery or dialogue can be done through simple gestures or body language. So just remember, and this is a case of when teaching in the classroom, it's not necessarily all about our dialogue. It's actually about all of the oracy skills that we incorporate, including our body language, and the way that we actually recognise what's going on at that time. A prime example would be the ability to continue discussing what's going on with the room and just simply acknowledging that that behaviour is there. Now, another one is, if needs be, schedule appointments. So schedule those appointments with student and staff so that you can set aside that designated time where you're unlikely to be disturbed, and make sure that those times are times where people are aware that you're unlikely to be disturbed. Give it that 100% focus, particularly when you're dealing with staff members, and particularly when you're dealing with something that needs to build that confidence and rapport. And then if needs be, move away from anything that may distract you from listening. You may want to move away from any devices that may draw your attention away from being there and being present. So in certain circumstances, those fortunate leaders have a separate table. Move yourself away from your computer, move yourself away from your desktop, because what you may find is that as that conversation is taking place, if an email pops up or if anything else pops up on the screen, your eyesight will be automatically drawn to that. You can't afford for that to happen, because once again, that moves your focus and attention off what is there in front of you, off of that dialogue in front of you. So be present, make sure that you're there, and make sure that you're showing your willingness to engage in that conversation. Now, the second thing that I'd advise on is asking the right questions. It boils back to this idea that leadership doesn't have to be about owning the room or being the smartest person in it. By asking the right questions, this can lead to the ability to foster productive and intelligent communication, in which you act as a facilitator to encouraging those collaborative questioning development as a cohort. So you really want to encourage others to do all the, to necessarily to guide the communication along, to guide that dialogue along. You want to be posing questions instead of answers, and you really want to develop that. In students, you want to develop a deeper, independent understanding of concepts and allowing them to become critical thinkers. And in staff, what this dialogue allows for is them to begin to take ownership of a strategic development, and them to be able to see their own participation in it. So there are a couple of tips to provide you with this. The first one is ensure that questions are open and allow for ideas to be expanded on through simple questioning. So it's that strategy that can be adopted in and out of the classroom, the whole idea of developing that deepening of questioning by just asking things like why, or an understanding of further ideas. And it could also be useful to consider your questions prior to the conversation. So in the case of more formal meetings, for example, or meetings where you have a specific focus point that needs to get out, or even lessons, it might actually be useful to prepare questions in advance. Now, obviously, those questions will have to adapted. It's all based on situational analysis at the end of the day. So they may need to be adapted, or they may need to deviate slightly based on the conversation, but at least those foundations will ensure that that learning or training, they are developed, and you're on the right tracks with it. Also acknowledge the fact that when dealing with colleagues, you will not be the expert on every single subject. That is one of the key places where leaders it can be a downfall. Understand the fact that you are not the expert in absolutely everything, and an effective leader does this and actually utilizes this in their own interest, and allows for that amalgamation of ideas and skills in order to create a strong cohort of individuals. The third one is the ability to speak less and listen more. We're all guilty of this at some point, and we're all also guilty of exhibiting poor listening skills in a way. A lot of us out there will be like, well, no, because we have this dialogue and we're able to listen to other people and we're able to respond and show our responses. But being completely honest with yourself, are you listening or are you planning your own response? And that's where we begin to think, are we actually effective listeners as opposed to just effective speakers? So are we effective communicators or are we effective speakers? Now, although we may not be consciously making the decision to disengage with the dialogue, it is quite common to be thinking about what we're going to say next, as opposed to listening about what's being spoken about. We're all guilty of it. And we're keen on considering what we're going to say. We then become guilty of poor listening skills. In a similar manner to the previous factor, high caliber leadership is all about developing a dialogue with others, as opposed to leading a one-sided perception and approach. Now, admittedly, as with the recognition that both dialogic and monologic teaching strategies are both useful approaches to teaching in the classroom, there's always going to be certain circumstances where there is a distinct need for clarity and explicit instruction. Communication and leadership is still, it's all about that situational analysis, and that's what it goes back down to. Is it an appropriate time to do this method, or is it an appropriate time to do this method? And those decisions sometimes have to be quite reactive, but we still need to be thinking long term and embracing the communication skills that we have in front of us. Now, a couple of tips to support this. Once again, as I've just said, consider which approach is best suited for the information that you're trying to convey to the audience. Once this is planned, ensure that all the information is, of course, clear and concise. It goes back to that idea of the best laid plans. The best laid plans will always be there. However, they do have to be adapted. And I think the strongest leaders and the strongest teachers and the strongest individuals are those that have a plan in place, but understand the fact that it may need to deviate sometimes, it may need to be adapted. And those kind of, the ability to be fluid as opposed to just set straight and that's the only way that it can be, really help to engage with any types of communication. It may also be useful to provide visual support in order to develop the knowledge acquisition and deliver the key information. So sometimes it is helpful to be able to provide the PowerPoint. So I know that there's a lot going on in regards to the metacognition and dual coding. We need to be able to provide them with as much support as possible in order to develop that knowledge acquisition. Now, the third thing is to consider your emotional intelligence. And by considering our emotional intelligence, we're therefore understanding what good communication looks like. Now, it's not to be perceived as simply a soft leadership approach. The idea of emotional intelligence does not make you a soft leader. It's actually the ability to recognize characteristics and be competent with understanding your audience. So it's the ability to actually understand your audience. It's technically what we could also refer to as the ability to reading the room. By being both empathetic and self-aware, a lot of this factor has to do with the previously acknowledged components of effective oracy skills. So understanding the fact that it's not just about what's being spoken, but it's actually the tone of voice, the pace, the speech, it's the body language, it's the cognitive ability and the linguistic content. It's all of those key areas, and it's the acknowledgement of them all. It's the ability to recognize a situation and emotion based on elements such as the body language, tone, pace of speech. And by being able to read your recipient's emotions through assessing these components, this will support your ability to adapt and strategically guide your responses in order to deter from any kind of negative repercussions and in order to ensure that the communication between the two of you is effective, or more, depending on how many people are there. So in class, it can be exemplified through considering the effects of pushing a student outside of their comfort zone. In these circumstances, it's important to be able to recognise the difference between a positive stressor and a negative one. If a student feels uncomfortable, their posture and their tone might change. They may become withdrawn and inaudible. And if the situation is actually read incorrectly, it could have a negative effect, and it could create potentially a volatile encounter. However, that's not necessarily suggesting that they should be avoided at all costs. It's just we need to understand where that line is. And when considering colleagues, it's actually the ability to think about whether or not a conversation is relevant or necessary for that particular moment in time. If a colleague is displaying signs of agitation or stress, it would be unwise to enter into a conversation in that moment to maybe add to the situation, unless of course it's actually necessary to do so. Often the knowledge that it would be wiser to approach the subject in a calmer time, in a more suitable time, may therefore lead to a more composed conversation and actually a more productive one as well. We need to be realistic, and we need to accept and understand the fact that everybody's human, everybody has these emotions, and sometimes the outcome of a conversation can be decided by outside factors that we can't really take into consideration. The next one along, so the final one that I'd kind of understand is the idea to keep calm and carry on. Yeah, panic is never positive. There is a distinct difference between stress and panic. Stress is a heightened emotion that provides a rapid response to alleviate the issue, whereas panic, it's an immediate and it's an exaggerated reaction to a situation. Panic is of course contagious, and it should be eradicated or at least lessened before speaking. Okay, either as the speaker or the recipient, it's important to recognize the fact that panic is something that can lead the conversation or the dialogue down the wrong route. Often it's the response of a mind wanting to provide an immediate response to a stressor. It's almost like referred to as a knee-jerk reaction. This results in words being said or perhaps decisions being made that in reflection don't need to be. When we think about students, for example, it's easy for students to subconsciously mirror our body language and communication. So if we become confrontational, chances are that they will do this too. If we are dealing with a heightened situation and we demonstrate a calm and concise manner, actually it's likely that we'll be able to support the students in decreasing their own emotional response. This is not to say that the key to success is the ability to remain calm and consumed, remain calm and collected at all times. It is important to remind staff and to remind ourselves about the analogy of the fizzy drinks bottle. Now, the more that a fizzy drinks bottle is shook, the more chances it is, the more compressed the gas. If the bottle is continuously shaking with the lid tightened, it's likely that the bottle will explode due to the pressure and the inability to contain it. If the lid is gently unscrewed so that the air can be slowly released, this means that the gradual release in the air will prevent any combustions from taking place. It's the same with our emotions. By unscrewing them, it's not necessarily going along and shouting at every individual, but only shouting at them a minuscule amount. It's actually being able to share maybe our concerns or our stresses with someone else, or finding an approach to alleviating these stresses in a small, calm and collected way so that we're not letting everything boil on top of each other. So those are some tips that should hopefully be able to support you in that manner. But I just want to move slightly on to the idea of written communication now. And written communication is something that we all need to think about. It's something that we all acknowledge being professionals, but it's something that we need to share with students as well. And actually, the idea of, for example, Mehebrian is often commonly misquoted for his research into body language. Amongst those who consider styles of communication important, it is implied that 93% of all communication is nonverbal. If that was simply the case, I would predict that a lot more of us would be daring to use an emoji in our professional correspondence. The realistic conclusion is that it's actually 7% comprehension comes from words, 38% of inference is derived from tone, voice, volume, rate of speech, pitch. 55% is the facial expressions, hand gestures, postures, and other forms of body language. So there's loads of different components. Oracy skills makes up so much, and there are so many different components that we need to bear in mind. So written communication, what's so significant about this is we're actually taking out one of those key components by removing this idea of being able to see any kind of visual guidance. We therefore need to be careful, and we need to be more aware of the actual content that's involved. So when we think about it, there are actually, one of the biggest ones is recognizing the way that we sign off. Okay, so the way that we sign off emails. Now, the tone of emails can often be judged by their signature. Troll through your emails and you'll soon discover that no matter how diligent you are, you appear to have a specific tell based on your audience and your subject matter. You might actually find that you use different signatures for different people. And what would be quite interesting about that is it will allow you to understand how you communicate with others. I began to notice a couple of key traits. For example, thanks. If we use thanks, it's a general email to a member of the department or the whole department. It's non-judgmental, straight to the point. Thanks in advance. One of those situations where the task you've set is almost expected, whether the recipient likes it or not, can be quite tongue-in-cheek, can be quite rude, that one in the slightest. But it is one that I've seen before. Kind regards is obviously the one that we're the one that we should be teaching our students to use. It's usually to a parent or alternatively to a senior professional who probably doesn't know your name. It's probably someone that you might will have more of an authoritarian attitude. Regards is a less detached signature that you could quite easily be saved for those letters or emails that you're writing against your will. And then finally, nothing. Yeah, the idea for nothing, straight to the point, almost an air of no chit chat, get the job done. Easiest to be misconstrued depending on the audience or the topic. So even just what you might presume to be a blasé, quick spoken, like quickly written email that you needed to get something across, think about how it could come across to the other people. Think about how it could come across to the recipients, particularly if you're dealing with an entire department or an entire cohort. How would staff misconstrue this in different ways? So what is the solution? Well, it's quite simple, really, but it can be easily be misunderstood. We're not saying that you should be over-analysing everything that you read and over-analysing your correspondence, because that's not right. Okay, we don't need to turn every single email into a psychoanalytical review, but there are a couple of things that we can do around supporting written communication. So the first one is obviously proofread your email. Think about how many times a day you shout at students and tell them to proofread their work, and then consider how many emails that you've written over the course of the day and how many you've actually read back to yourself. And unfortunately, what you might find is that you're not following your own advice. And if that's the case, just give it a try. Yeah, it's one of the biggest things that we can do. Now think about clarity. So are you getting a point across? If you're asking a question, should it be a 2-page essay? Does it need to be 6 paragraphs long? Or can it just be short, to the point? It doesn't make it blunt, it makes it clear if it's done in the right way. Going back on this, if you are discussing a sensitive matter, obviously that's where that situational analysis comes back into play, and blunt and to the point wouldn't necessarily go down well in that one. Now consider your audience. So when all else fails, keep it formal, keep it simple. You don't want to be testing any levels, okay? We always have that, there are always going to be situations where you might have a bit of joke or a bit of a banter with someone. Doing it over email, particularly doing it over a staff email, isn't necessarily the place to try that. And mainly, we don't try these kind of things because we can't read people's reactions via email. So it's always just a little helpful hint and tip there. And then think about whether a video call or a meeting would actually be a more beneficial option. So if you have something important to say, is it a meeting or is it a written, and vice versa? If, do you have to call a meeting with everyone, or could you just send a quick email? It's one of those. Think about which one would be more beneficial, less time consuming, more efficient, and the most effective form of communication for that scenario. Okay, and we all know this one. It's the ability to read the signs. And when we read the signs, the word that we hate more than anything is "I'm fine." Okay, now for colleagues, for students, for anybody that we have interaction with on a day-to-day basis, The ability to understand forms of communication also includes the ability to understand how people, not necessarily how they might be feeling, but to understand that there are certain visual cues, there are certain signs that might indicate to us that there's something deeper that we either need to investigate or that we need to provide them support with. So in a normal day-to-day conversation, this simple statement, it could be a throwaway response in retort to a simplified inquiry into a person's health. So how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. But consider whether, in actual fact, the question itself, does it come with anything else? You know, does it come with any other factors there that we might need to take into consideration? So it's things like thinking about the body language. So are they busying themselves? Are they avoiding eye contact? Are their movements perhaps more annotated, less annotated? Think about the volume. Is it quite high? Is it quite, you know, the tone, is it quite high? Is it quite low? Is it quite loud? Is it quite silent? All of these can play them contributing factors into allowing us to at least give a brief interpretation as to how someone might be feeling. Think about the tone. So does the response appear rehearsed? Is there a reassurance visible, or is it more like an avoidance? So is it a reassurance or an avoidance? And then contextualize the situation. So think about how you'd be reacting in a similar situation or a similar circumstance. What has actually happened? How might this person feel? What are the realistic emotions that one might demonstrate in these situations? We need to understand our stuff, and we need to know and be able to, the best leaders are able to read the signals, and they're able to read the signs and understand the fact that every single staff member is an individual, and they all will exhibit different signs and signals as to what communication might be best with them at that particular time, and obviously the degree of like communication that could be involved with it. So we need to think of that. And that's actually where coaching comes in. So coaching, what this enables for is it enables the building of the dialogue between professionals in a professional manner, but not necessarily in a leadership idea. So coaching models can support in the planning and implementation of effective coaching. They can therefore provide a consistent framework for a flow of conversation, particularly if you might find that conversation is a bit forced, or if it is a concept that you're attempting to create with a set of individuals in a similar way that we would in a classroom. We need to provide them with some kind of script to get the conversation started, to get that dialogue flowing and moving. Coaching interaction allows staff to communicate with each other and provides opportunities for collaboration with colleagues. Collaboration is the strongest method of teaching and learning, in my opinion. The ability for colleagues to collaborate with each other really engages them with this idea of teaching and learning research and developing their own professional abilities, capabilities through what they're interested in. And the coaching model, this approach works to improve the environment by focusing on the development of each staff member instead of attempting to deal with situations as and when they arrive. It instead seeks to develop the foundations and consequently improves the long-term successes of the setting of the educational establishment that's there. One of the coaching models that's obviously out there at the moment that quite a lot of people know is GROW. This is one that I found works quite well because it's small enough that it acts as a springboard for conversation as opposed to a specific script. So it's all about finding that goal, finding the reality, providing and considering all of the options available, and then the wrap up is the evaluation. It's the next steps. That is so important. The ability to wrap up isn't necessarily the ability to end the conversation, but it's to decide the next level of where the conversation is going and how to move that conversation along further. It involves questions like, well, okay, so what are you going to do about it? What do you think you need to do right now? What can you do in the future? What are the targets going to be? What are the biggest takeaways? By having these kind of conversations, it enables practitioners to feel like they're able, they're making their own steps forward based on what they want to do. Coaching models leads in quite nicely with triangulation, the concept of triangulation. It's another form of coaching. It is less prescriptive and it's focused more on the dialogue between you know, as opposed to a specific outcome. So whereas the coaching models and the use of the coaching models really enforce that idea of specific outcomes and strategic timeframes, triangulation is more of a development through dialogue, so to speak. It establishes capabilities and ensures the effectiveness of these collaborative groups, and really allows them to find this common purpose. In some circumstances, triangulation is the ability to introduce a mediator into a dialogue, but when we think about it in regards to becoming an effective practitioner, becoming an effective leader, actually triangulation is the ability to share and develop your own practice with others. And it's an opportunity to have an open channel of communication that really allows you to expand and reflect. So not only would I suggest incorporating this method with your departments, with your staff members, but also attempting it yourself as well, attempting to set up your own triangulation group in order for that coaching and that dialogue to be developed with others as well. So that leads me to the summary. Now, obviously this is quite a lot of information, and I hope that you found it useful. Just to summarize a couple of the quick key points that I would find useful for this effective communication. First of all, daily or weekly check-ins with members of staff or students can help to identify any situations before they develop into serious issues. It's not necessarily going up, you know, it's not like when you go into a restaurant and there's an actual tick board that's there that they have to ask if everything's okay with your meal in the first 10 minutes of you arriving. It's not that. It's just attempting to open the channels of communication with people on a day-to-day basis, and just maintaining that openness there, so when you do have to eventually start a dialogue with someone, it's not completely unique, it's not completely out of your comfort zone. Recognize that each individual may demonstrate different reactions, or different indicators will support different interpretations. We are all different, okay? We say it time and time again that when you're teaching a classroom, you need to understand that you're teaching a group of individuals in a classroom. You're not teaching a class, you're teaching individuals in a classroom. It's the same with staff. So when we're dealing with staff, we're dealing with a cohort of staff, but every single one of them is an individual, okay? Now think about the factors that can affect the outcome of a conversation. Okay, and it's important to consider the contributing factors and how you can actually either support or you can avoid certain breakdowns of communication from happening. So it may mean that you need to schedule a formal meeting if a conversation is going a certain way. It may be the fact that you need to give that person, or you need to give yourself time to think about what you're going to say next in order to make sure that you're getting everything. It is an effective dialogue. Remember that breaks or dinner times are scarce and they're sacred. Yeah, the concept of having a meeting then defies the purpose of their existence, so don't do it. Don't be that person that schedules a meeting for a break or a dinner time, because automatically you're going to be starting that conversation on the wrong footing. And there's also those that may dwell on the content of a meeting if you schedule it in advance. So make sure that when you're scheduling it, I would always suggest providing a brief summary of the purpose, so that if necessary, the individual actually has time to prepare. And remember that communication can't always be a one-way street. Effective leaders are those that acknowledge that they may not have the answers or knowledge for everything. They are the ones that will support where they can, or seek further investigation somewhere, direct them to someone that may know, or really seek to develop their own understanding as well. Ensure that communication is meaningful and it ensures that the intention is achieved. Don't go off piste. Stick to where you want that outcome, you know, where do you want that outcome to be, and reflect on that afterwards. Reflect on whether the conversation went in the right way. Was it an appropriate, if there was a breakdown in communication, where did that breakdown in communication occurred? You know, reflection and evaluation are key and critical in order to communicate effectively in the long run. And development from communication isn't linear in regards to positions. Often it is actually the encouragement of peers in a realistic and truthful discussion that can provide the most effective outcome for an individual. So think whether it's you as a leader that needs to have that conversation, or could that conversation be more beneficial if it was a peer collaboration? That's everything from me. I hope that you found this useful. If you do have any questions, you can always get me on my Twitter handle, which is at sjdavies87. This understanding is actually taken from a chapter of my book, which is due for release around about December 2020 with John Cat Ed, and that's going to be referred to as Talking About Oracy, which I'm very excited. So like I said, if you've got any other questions, don't hesitate to get in contact with me. Thank you.